You know that moment when someone says something so unexpected, so raw, that it stops your world completely? Well, last Tuesday, while I was elbow deep in a broken air conditioning unit, a 50-year-old woman looked me straight in the eye and said, "I think I'm falling for my handyman." What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love, second chances, the courage it takes to start over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me start from the beginning, because trust me, you're going to want the whole story. My name is Adam, and I've been fixing things for as long as I can remember. Not just because I'm good with my hands, though. 20 years in HVAC repair will teach you a thing or two about persistence. But because there's something deeply satisfying about taking something broken and making it work again. Maybe it's the control. Maybe it's the fact that air conditioners don't argue back or change their minds halfway through a conversation. Run Morrison's Climate Solutions out of a small shop on the south side of Phoenix, Arizona. It's not glamorous, just me, my van loaded with tools, and a steady stream of customers who call when their AC units decide to give up during the brutal desert summers. Phoenix in July is no joke. When someone's air conditioning breaks, I'm not just fixing a machine, I'm restoring their will to live. Tuesday mornings are usually my catch-up time. I review service calls, order parts, and try to map out the most efficient route through the city's sprawling suburbs. But this particular Tuesday, July 15th, to be exact, started with a voice message that would completely derail my carefully planned routine. "Hi, this is Jenny Morrison, no relation to your business name?" I checked. Her laugh was warm, genuine. "My AC unit decided to stage a rebellion sometime around midnight, and I'm hoping you can stage a counter-revolution before." I melt into a puddle. I'm at 4247 Desert Rose Lane in Ahwatukee. "Call me back when you get this. I'll be the one slowly dissolving in my living room." I found myself smiling at the message. Most of my emergency calls are frantic, sometimes hostile. People don't handle heat well, and they tend to take their frustration out on whoever shows up to fix their problem. But Jenny sounded different. Stressed, sure, but there was humor in her voice. Like she understood that mechanical failures are just part of life's great comedy. I called her back within 10 minutes. She answered on the first ring. "Please tell me you're my air conditioning savior," she said without preamble. "Depends," I replied, already reaching for my appointment book. "How do you feel about miracles before noon?" "I'm cautiously optimistic," she said, though at this point I'd settle for a gentle breeze and the promise that I won't spontaneously combust. I scheduled her for 10 a.m., which gave me enough time to handle a quick filter replacement across town. As I drove through Phoenix's endless grid of streets, past strip malls and housing developments that all looked vaguely identical, I caught myself thinking about her voice. There was something about the way she talked, confident but not demanding, frustrated but not bitter. In my line of work, you learn to read people quickly. Angry customers, indecisive customers, customers who hover over your shoulder questioning every move. Jenny didn't sound like any of those. Desert Rose Lane turned out to be in one of those established neighborhoods where the houses have actual character instead of cookie-cutter uniformity. Mature palm trees lined the streets, and the homes showed the kind of thoughtful landscaping that only comes from people who've lived somewhere long enough to care about it. Jenny's house was a single-story ranch style, painted a warm terracotta color with dark green trim. The front yard was xeriscaped with native plants and decorative rocks, practical for the desert. But arranged with an artistic eye, I parked my van in the driveway, grabbed my diagnostic tools, and approached the front door. Before I could knock, it opened, and I got my first look at Jenny Morrison. She was probably around 5'6", shoulder-length brown hair that showed just enough silver to suggest she'd stopped worrying about hiding her age. She wore a simple blue sundress and sandals, and her face had the kind of laugh lines that come from someone who genuinely enjoys life. But what struck me most were her eyes, hazel, direct, and completely without pretense. She looked like someone who'd figured out who she was and was comfortable with that knowledge. "You must be Adam," she said, extending her hand. "Jenny Morrison, fellow survivor of this desert furnace." Her handshake was firm, confident. Nice to meet you. Tell me about this rebellion your AC is staging. She laughed, and I noticed how it seemed to come from somewhere genuine. Well, it started making this grinding noise around midnight like it was trying to eat itself from the inside out. Then it just gave up entirely around 3 a.m. I've been camping out in my kitchen with the refrigerator door open. Creative solution, I said. Though probably not great for your electric bill. At this point, I'd pay extra just to feel cold air on my face, she replied. The unit's around back. Fair warning, I may have said some unkind things to it earlier this morning. As she led me through her house to the backyard, I noticed the details.
Ow.
Books everywhere stacked on tables, filling built-in shelves.
Ow.
The walls were covered with what looked like original artwork, not expensive pieces, but things chosen because she loved them. There was a guitar leaning against the couch, and sheet music scattered on the coffee table. This wasn't just a house. It was clearly a home. The AC unit sat on a concrete pad behind the house, a standard residential model that looked to be about 10 years old. I could hear the problem before I even opened the access panel, a grinding, clicking noise that meant something inside had definitely given up the ghost. Well, I said, kneeling down to examine the unit, the good news is, it's definitely broken. That's the good news? Jenny asked, though she was smiling. Now the good news is that means I can fix it, I clarified. The bad news is it's going to take a while. And that's how I ended up spending the next several hours at Jenny Morrison's house. Completely unaware that by the end of the day, everything I thought I knew about my simple, predictable life would be turned completely upside down. Within 20 minutes of starting my diagnosis, I had confirmed what I suspected the compressor fan motor had seized, and the capacitor was fried. It was fixable, but it would require a trip to the supply house for parts. That's when Jenny appeared beside me with a tall glass of ice water and what looked like homemade lemonade. Thought you might need some hydration, she said, settling onto a patio chair she'd dragged over from her back deck. Plus, I figured if I'm going to watch someone save my sanity, I should at least provide refreshments. I accepted the water gratefully. The Phoenix heat was already climbing toward 105. Working in direct sunlight was like being slowly roasted alive. You don't have to babysit me, I said. Most people just leave me to work and check in every hour or so. Most people probably don't work from home, she replied. I'm a freelance editor, and my office is right there. She gestured toward a window that looked out onto the backyard. Besides, it's been a while since I've had any interesting company. There was something in the way she said it, not lonely. Exactly, but like she'd grown accustomed to solitude without necessarily choosing it. I found myself curious about her story, which was unusual. Normally, I focused on the work and kept conversations strictly professional. But Jenny had this way of making everything feel like a natural conversation between old friends. What kind of editing do you do? I asked, pulling the access panel completely off to get a better look at the damage. Mostly technical manuals and corporate communications, she said. Thrilling stuff like best practices for quarterly, financial reporting, and employee handbook updates for remote work policies. I tell people I help make boring things slightly less boring. I laughed. That actually sounds more challenging than what I do. If a fan motor is broken, it's broken. No interpretation required. Oh, but there's definitely interpretation in what you do, she said, watching me work. You're reading symptoms, making diagnoses, figuring out solutions. Just that your patients are machines instead of paragraphs. I paused in my work and looked at her. Most people saw HVAC repair as grunt work, necessary but not requiring much thought. Jenny was the first person in years to suggest there might be some skill involved. I never thought of it that way. Said simply, people who are naturally good at something often don't realize how complex it actually is. As I worked, she kept up a steady stream of conversation that somehow never felt intrusive. She told me about her neighborhood, how the Kowalskis next door had lived there for 40 years and still brought her vegetables from their garden, how the family across the street had 3 teenagers who practiced drums in their garage every afternoon at exactly 3:30. She talked about the local coffee shop that knew her order by heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. and the bookstore downtown where she sometimes helped out during their busy seasons. But it was the way she talked about these things that struck me. There was warmth there, genuine affection for her community, but also a kind of wistfulness. It's like she was describing a life she appreciated but hadn't fully stepped into. You? She asked, as I began disconnecting the faulty motor. How long have you been saving people from heat stroke? About 15 years in Phoenix, I said. I moved here from Oregon after my divorce, figured if my life was going to be a disaster, at least I could be warm while it fell apart. I immediately regretted the overshare. I don't usually volunteer personal information to customers, especially not about my failed marriage. But something about Jenny's easy openness made me want to match it. Divorce is rough, she said without any of the awkward sympathy most people. Offered how long ago? 5 years now? I said. Ancient history. What about you? Married, divorced, dedicated to your independence? She was quiet for a moment, and I worried I'd overstepped. But then she smiled. Divorced. 3 years ago, after 22 years of marriage, Robert decided he needed to find himself, which apparently required a 20-year-old yoga instructor named Harmony. Harmony. I couldn't help but grin. Seriously? Couldn't make that up if I tried, Jenny said, laughing. The worst part is, she actually seems nice. Makes it hard to hate her properly. That is the worst part, I agreed. Much easier when they're obviously terrible people. Exactly. Where's the satisfaction in righteous indignation when your replacement is probably genuinely sweet and makes amazing green smoothies? We both laughed, and I realized something had shifted in the last few minutes. We'd moved past polite customer service provider conversation into something that felt more real, more personal. It should have made me uncomfortable, I prided myself on maintaining professional boundaries, but instead it felt natural. So what does finding yourself at 50 look like? I asked, genuinely curious. Jenny considered this, tilting her head slightly as she watched me work. I'm still figuring that out. For 22 years, I was Robert's wife, then later Robert's wife, and Michael's mother. When Michael left for college 4 years ago, I was just Robert's wife. Now I'm just ... Jenny. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. There was something about the way she said it that made me look up from the motor housing. She wasn't fishing for sympathy or looking for validation. She was simply stating a fact about her life with the same directness she'd used to describe her broken air conditioner. But I could see the complexity underneath the mixture of grief and excitement that comes with reinventing yourself later in life. How's that working out so far? I asked, being just Jenny. She smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it seemed like she was really seeing me instead of just making polite conversation with the repairman. Better than I expected, scarier than I hoped, but definitely more interesting than being half of someone else. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Independence is underrated until you lose it. Then it's the most precious thing in the world. Exactly, she said, leaning forward slightly. Though I have to admit, there are times when having someone around to troubleshoot the air conditioning would be convenient. The way she said it was playful, almost flirtatious, but not in a way that felt forced or desperate. It was more like she was testing the waters, seeing how I'd respond to something that could be interpreted as either friendly banter or something more. I felt my heart rate pick up slightly, which was ridiculous. I was 38 years old. Not some teenager getting flustered by a pretty woman's attention, but there was something about Jenny that threw me off balance in the best possible way. Well, I said, trying to match her light tone, that's what service contracts are for. She laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. Is that your professional recommendation, Dr. HVAC? Among other things, I said, then immediately wondered what the hell I meant by that. But Jenny just smiled and settled back in, her chair apparently content to watch me work while we fell into a comfortable silence. And as I focused on removing the damaged components, I found myself thinking that this was turning into one of the more interesting service calls of my career. By noon, I had the broken parts removed and a clear picture of what needed to be replaced. The heat was becoming unbearable, even for someone used to working in Phoenix summers. I was wiping sweat from my forehead when Jenny appeared again, this time carrying a plate of sandwiches and a pitcher of fresh iced tea. Lunch break, she announced, setting everything down on a small patio table. I figured you might be getting hungry, and I needed an excuse to escape my office anyway. I've been editing the same paragraph for 20 minutes. Don't have. To feed me, I said, though my stomach betrayed me with an audible rumble. I'd skipped breakfast in my rush to get to her house. Consider it part of the service experience, she said with a grin. Besides, I made extra, and I hate eating alone. We sat in the shade of her covered patio, and I found myself genuinely relaxing for the first time all day. The sandwiches were simple but perfect: turkey, avocado, and some kind of tangy spread. On fresh bread, the iced tea was clearly homemade, with just the right balance of sweet and tart.
Nice.
This is incredible, I said after the first bite. Do you always cook for your repair guys? Only the ones who don't make me feel like I'm being judged for not knowing how to fix my own air conditioning, she replied. You'd be surprised how many service calls turn into lectures about basic maintenance. That's ridiculous, I said. Nobody expects you to know how to rebuild a compressor motor. That's like me getting annoyed that you can't edit your own technical manuals. Exactly, Jenny said, leaning forward with enthusiasm. Though, to be fair, I probably could learn basic AC maintenance if I really wanted to. I just have zero interest in it. What do you have interest in? I asked. Besides making boring corporate documents less boring? She paused, fork halfway. To her mouth, and I realized it might have been a more complex question than I intended. She seemed to be genuinely considering it, like maybe no one had asked her that in a while. Music, she said finally. I've been teaching myself guitar for the past 2 years. I'm terrible at it, but I love it anyway. And I've been thinking about taking pottery classes. There's something appealing about making things with my hands, instead of just rearranging words on a screen. Music and pottery, I repeated. A good combination. Creative but practical. What about you? She asked. What do you do when you're not rescuing people from heat stroke? I found myself hesitating. Most people weren't particularly interested in my hobbies. I restore old motorcycles, I said finally. Classic bikes from the 70s and 80s? It's completely impractical, but there's something satisfying about bringing something back to life. Jenny's face lit up. That's incredible. Do you have any pictures? I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of my current project, a 1978 Honda CB750 that I'd been working on for months. She studied the images with genuine interest, asking questions about the engine, the paint job, the custom work I'd done. It's beautiful, she said, handing my phone back. You have an artist's eye for this kind of thing. It's just mechanical work, I said, though I was pleased by the compliment. No, it's not, she said firmly. Look at the way you chose those. Colors, the attention to detail in the chrome work. You're not just fixing an engine, you're creating something beautiful. It's art. I stared at her, caught off guard by how she saw something I'd never really articulated to myself. In 15 years of HVAC work, no one had ever suggested that what I did had any creative component. But the way Jenny talked about it made me see my own work differently. I never thought of it that way, I admitted. That's because you're being modest, she said. Or maybe because you're a man, and society tells men they can't be artists unless they're starving in a garret somewhere. I laughed. Are you always this insightful about strangers? Only when the strangers are interesting, she replied, and there was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully. We had moved beyond casual conversation into something that felt more like discovery. The way she asked questions, the way she listened to my answers, the way she seemed genuinely curious about who I was beyond my professional function. It was intoxicating in a way I hadn't experienced in years. After lunch, I returned to work on the AC unit, but the dynamic had shifted again. Jenny stayed outside, sometimes reading a book, sometimes just watching me work. We talked sporadically about music, about Phoenix, about the weird satisfaction of fixing things that are broken. But there were also comfortable silences, moments, where the only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bird calling from one of her neighbor's trees. Around 2 p.m., I finished installing the new motor and capacitor. I was running through the final diagnostic checks when Jenny appeared beside me again, this time with a serious expression on her face. Adam, she said, and something in her tone made me look up from the electrical panel. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, though I suddenly felt nervous without knowing why. She was quiet for a moment, looking like she was gathering courage for something. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady but softer than before. "Do you think it's possible for someone to surprise themselves? To discover they're capable of feeling things they didn't expect?" The question was so unexpected, so intimate, that I found myself setting down my multimeter and giving her my full attention. "What do you mean?" Jenny took a deep breath, and when she looked at me, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I mean, I've been divorced for 3 years. Spent those 3 years convincing myself that I was. Done with all of this, done with attraction, done with romance, done with the complications that come with caring about someone. I thought I was happy being independent, focusing on my work, my music, my own interests." She paused, and I realized I was holding my breath. "But then you showed up this morning," she continued, "and I find myself thinking thoughts I haven't had in years. Feeling things I thought I was too old, to set in my ways, too smart to feel again. My heart was beating so fast I was surprised she couldn't hear it. Jenny, ... I'm 50 years old, Adam," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm 50 years old, and I think I'm falling for my handyman." The words hung in the air between us like something fragile and precious. I stared at her, this brave, complicated, beautiful woman who had just offered me something I hadn't even realized I was hoping for. "I know how that sounds," she continued quickly, apparently mistaking my silence for rejection. "I know this is crazy. You came here to fix my air conditioning, not to deal with a middle-aged woman having some kind of emotional crisis. I just... I needed to say it, because I haven't felt this alive in years, and I think you're the reason why." I realized I had been quiet too long when I saw doubt creeping into her expression. She started to turn away, probably to retreat back into the safety of polite customer service provider distance. "Jenny, wait," I said, reaching out too gently. "Touch her arm." She stopped, looking back at me with those incredible hazel eyes that had been throwing me off balance all day. "You're not having an emotional crisis," I said slowly. "You're definitely not too old for anything. If it makes you feel any better, I've been thinking the same thoughts since about 10 minutes after I met you." The smile that spread across her face was like watching the sun come up. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone like it was some kind of alien device. Jenny had given me her number before I left, not for professional reasons. This time, but with a shy smile and the words, "In case you want to continue this conversation somewhere, it doesn't involve power tools." I'd been home for 3 hours, and I still couldn't process what had happened. A 50-year-old woman, a beautiful, intelligent, accomplished woman, had basically told me she was falling for me. Instead of running in the opposite direction, like any sensible person would, I'd admitted I felt the same way. What the hell was I thinking? I called my brother Noah, because he was the only person I knew who wouldn't immediately tell me I was having some kind of midlife crisis. Noah lived in Tucson, ran a small construction company, and had been happily married to the same woman. For 15 years, if anyone could give me perspective on this situation, it was him. "Let me get this straight," Noah said after I'd explained the day's events. "You went to fix an air conditioner, ended up having lunch with a customer, and she told you she's falling for you? That's the simplified version, yes? You told her you felt the same way?" "I may have indicated that, yes." There's a long pause. "Adam, how long has it been since you've been on an actual date?" I had to think about it. "Maybe 8 months? That woman Sarah from the coffee shop near my apartment? We went out twice." "Right, Sarah, who you described as nice but kind of boring, and before that, I don't know, maybe a year before that? So you're telling me that in the past 2 years you've been on maybe 3 dates? And now you're falling for a customer who's 12 years older than you?" When he put it like that, it sounded insane. "She doesn't seem 12 years older," I said weakly. "That's not the point, and you know it. The point is, are you sure this isn't just because you've been living like a monk for the past 5 years? Consider this. After my divorce from Lisa, I'd thrown myself into work and avoided anything that looked like a serious relationship. It wasn't a conscious decision initially. I was just tired of the drama. Tired of trying to make something work with someone who clearly didn't want the same things I did. But somewhere along the way, Isolation had become comfortable, predictable, safe. I don't think so, I said finally. This feels different. Different how? Different like. I struggled to find the words. Like I didn't realize how quiet my life had gotten until someone turned the music back on. Noah was quiet for a moment. That's either the most romantic thing you've ever said or you're having some kind of breakdown. Helpful, thanks. Look, Adam, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but you need to be honest about what you're getting into. She's 50, divorced, probably has a completely different life situation than you. Have you thought about what that means practically? I hadn't, actually. All day I'd been caught up in the feeling of connection, the unexpected pleasure of finding someone who seemed to genuinely see me. I hadn't considered the logistics. She has a grown son, I said, thinking out loud. Right, she's probably a grandmother, or will be soon. She's thinking about retirement while you're still building your business. She might want to travel, or move somewhere else, or have completely different priorities than someone our age. Every point Noah made was valid, and each one felt like a small weight settling on my chest. So you think I should forget about it? I think you should be realistic about it, he said gently. But I also think you sounded happier in the last 10 minutes than you have in years. So maybe don't overthink it to death before you even see where it goes. After I hung up with Noah, I sat on my couch with a beer, staring at the framed photo on my coffee table. It was a picture of the motorcycle I'd finished restoring last year. The Honda CB750 I'd shown Jenny. I'd taken the photo right after I got it running perfectly. Looking at it always gave me a sense of satisfaction. But tonight I found myself thinking about what Jenny had said. You're not just fixing an engine, you're creating something beautiful. It's art. No one had ever seen my hobby that way before. Most people either didn't understand why I spent so much time and money on old bikes, or they saw it as just another form of mechanical work. Jenny had looked at the photos and immediately understood that it was about more than function. She'd seen the aesthetic choices, the attention to detail, the way I'd tried to honor the original design while making it my own. In 5 minutes of conversation, she'd helped me understand something about myself that I'd never articulated. That's when I realized Noah was asking the wrong questions. It wasn't about whether Jenny was too old, or whether we were in different life stages, or whether this was practical. The question was whether I was brave enough to explore something that felt this right. Even if it didn't fit into any category I'd previously considered. I picked up my phone and started typing a text. Then I deleted it, and I started again. Finally, I settled on something simple. I keep thinking about our conversation today. Would you like to have dinner sometime this week? Somewhere with better air conditioning than your backyard? I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Her response came back within minutes. I thought you'd never ask. But I should warn you. I'm a lot more interesting in places with good lighting and wine. I found myself grinning at my phone like, a teenager? Is that a promise or a threat? Definitely a promise. Are you free Thursday? I know a place. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days to either talk myself out of this or figure out how to be the kind of man who could handle whatever Jenny Morrison turned out to be. Thursday's perfect, I typed back. Should I pick you up? How about we meet there? I'll send you the address. That way, if you decide I'm completely crazy, you can make a graceful exit. And if I decide you're exactly the right kind of crazy? There was a longer pause this time before her response came through. Then we'll figure that out. Together, I set my phone down and leaned back on my couch, trying to process what I'd just committed to. In the span of 1 day, I'd gone from being a guy who fixed air conditioners and avoided complications to being a guy who was apparently dating a 50-year-old, a woman who made him see himself differently. My phone buzzed with one more message. From Jenny. Thank you for today, Adam, for fixing my AC, for listening, for not running away when I said something completely insane. Sleep well, I typed back. Thank you for the best service call of my career. See you Thursday. As I got ready for bed, I caught myself humming, something I hadn't done in months. Maybe Noah was right, and I was setting myself up for complications I couldn't anticipate. Maybe the practical concerns about age and life stages would turn out to be insurmountable. But for the first time in years, I was looking forward to finding out. I fell asleep that night thinking about the way Jenny's face had lit up when I'd shown her pictures of my motorcycle, and the way she'd described my work as art. I thought about her courage in telling me how she felt, and the vulnerability in her eyes when she'd waited for my response. Most of all, I thought about her smile when I'd told her I felt the same way. Like watching the sun come up, I'd said to myself, and maybe that's exactly what this was, the beginning of something bright and warm after a long period of darkness. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Thursday arrived with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt since high school, I found. Myself changing shirts 3 times, settling on a simple button-down that Noah's wife Kelly had bought me for Christmas. "It brings out your eyes," she'd said. Though I'd never been entirely sure what that meant. Jenny had texted me the address of a place called Sage, a small bistro in Scottsdale, that I'd driven past 100 times but never entered. The kind of place with outdoor seating, string lights, and a menu that probably didn't include anything deep-fried. I arrived 10 minutes early and spent those minutes in my truck, questioning every decision that had led me to this moment. What if we had nothing to talk about outside the context of her broken air conditioner? What if the chemistry I'd felt was just situational, born out of proximity and her gratitude for fixing her AC? What if she took one look at me in an actual restaurant setting and realized she'd made a terrible mistake? I was still spiraling when I saw her walking across the parking lot. Every doubt I'd been harboring evaporated instantly. Jenny had traded her casual sundress for a flowing skirt in deep blue and a cream-colored blouse that somehow managed to be both elegant and approachable. Her hair was down, catching the early evening light, and she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever she happened to be. When she spotted me getting out of my truck, her face lit up with a smile that made my chest tight. "Clean up well," she said, as we met halfway across the parking lot. "So do you," I replied, then immediately felt stupid for such an obvious response. But Jenny just laughed. "I was nervous about this all day," she admitted. I kept thinking maybe Tuesday was some kind of heat-induced hallucination. "If it was, we're having the same hallucination," I said, and was rewarded with another one of those genuine smiles that seemed to start somewhere deep inside her. Sage turned out to be exactly the kind of place I'd expected intimate without. Being stuffy with a menu full of words I wasn't entirely sure how to pronounce, but Jenny navigated it like someone who belonged there, chatting easily with the hostess and suggesting wine pairings with a knowledge that made me realize how little I knew about her world. "I should probably warn you," she said as we settled into a corner table overlooking a small garden. I may have oversold myself. I'm not actually that sophisticated. I just watch a lot of cooking shows. Are you kidding? I was about to ask if you wanted to split a pizza, I said, which made her laugh so hard the couple at the next table looked over. "God, that sounds amazing." She said, "I love places like this, but sometimes I just want food that doesn't require instructions." The conversation flowed as easily as it had in her backyard, but with an added layer of intentionality that made everything feel more significant. We talked about our childhoods, hers in a small town in Colorado, mine in various military bases, before my dad retired and we settled in Phoenix. She told me about her son Michael, who was finishing his master's degree in environmental science, and rarely called unless he needed money or advice about girls. "He's a good kid," she said, showing me a recent photo on her phone. "But he's at that age where having a mom is slightly embarrassing. I think he'd die if he knew I was on a date." "Would he disapprove?" I asked, suddenly curious about the dynamic Jenny considered this. "I think he'd be surprised." After the divorce, I was pretty vocal about being done with men in relationships. I may have gone through a brief phase where I declared all of them unnecessary complications. "What changed your mind?" She looked at me over her wine glass, and there was something both playful and serious in her expression. A very patient handyman, who didn't run away when I had what he generously called an emotional breakthrough instead of a complete meltdown. "For the record," I said, "I never thought it was a meltdown. I thought it was brave or crazy. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." Our food arrived, some kind of salmon dish for her, pasta for me, that turned out to be much better than I'd expected. But I found myself paying more attention to Jenny than to the meal. The way she talked with her hands when she got excited about something. The way she listened, really listened, like she was collecting details about me to examine later. The way she seemed completely comfortable with silences, as if she understood that not every moment required words. "Can I ask you something?" Said during one of those comfortable pauses. "Anything. What made you say yes to this? And don't give me some polite answer about how nice I seem. I mean, really, what made you decide to have dinner with a woman who's old enough to be your, well, not your mother, but maybe your much older sister?" It was such a Jenny question, direct, self-aware, tinged with humor, but asking for real honesty. I set down my fork and thought about how to answer. "Do you want the complicated truth or the simple truth?" I asked. "Always the complicated truth. The complicated truth is that I've spent the last 5 years convincing myself that I was better off alone. That relationships were more trouble than they were worth. That I was happier focusing on work and my hobbies and not having to consider anyone else's needs or opinions. And then you opened your door Tuesday morning, and within about an hour, you made me remember what I'd been missing." Jenny was quiet, waiting for me to continue. "The simple truth is that you make me laugh, and you see things in me that I'd forgotten were there. And when you told me you were falling for your handyman, it was the first time in years that someone surprised me in a way that felt like a gift instead of a problem." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Touch was warm, slightly calloused from guitar playing, and completely without hesitation. "That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me," she said, "or you're really good at this dating thing." "I'm terrible at dating," I admitted. "I haven't been on a real date in over a year." "Well, you're doing fine so far," she said, squeezing my hand gently before letting go. "Though I should probably warn you that I'm out of practice too. My last relationship was with my ex-husband, and that ended with him leaving me for someone young enough to be our daughter. So my confidence in my dating abilities is not exactly at an all-time high." "His loss," I said, and meant it. "That now, but you haven't seen me try to be charming when I'm nervous. I tend to overshare and make inappropriate jokes. I like inappropriate jokes. Good, because I have a lot of them." We stayed at Sage until they started stacking chairs around us, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about the novel she'd been trying to write for 3 years, about her dream of learning to play piano, about the pottery classes she'd finally signed up for. I told her about the motorcycle I was planning to build from scratch, about my secret ambition to maybe teach automotive restoration someday, about the small house I'd been slowly renovating in my spare time by the time we walked back to our cars. The evening had taken on that golden quality that makes everything feel significant. We stood in the parking lot for a moment, neither of us seeming eager to end the night. "This was nice," Jenny said, which seemed like an understatement for what had felt like the most natural, comfortable, exciting evening I'd had in years. "It was," I agreed. "Would you like to do it again?" "Very much," she said, "though next time, maybe somewhere with pizza." "I feel like we need to properly test your theory about food that doesn't require instructions." "I know a place," I said, already planning our next date in my head. She smiled, stepped closer, and for a moment I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she reached up and straightened my collar, a gesture so intimate and unexpected that it sent electricity straight through me. "Drive safe, Adam," she said. "Text me when you get home so I know you made it okay." "You too," I managed to say, though my brain had mostly stopped working the moment she'd touched me. I watched her drive away, and sat in my truck for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't just attraction anymore, or the excitement of something new. This was the beginning of something that felt real and substantial and terrifying in the best possible way. My phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Thank you for a perfect evening. Sweet dreams," I typed back. "Thank you for taking a chance on your handyman." Her response came quickly. "Best decision I've made in years." As I drove home through the Phoenix night, I found myself smiling at nothing in particular, already counting the hours until I could see her again. Over the next 3 weeks, Jenny and I settled into something that felt both thrilling and surprisingly comfortable. We texted throughout the day, not constantly, but with the kind of easy back and forth that made me look forward to the buzz of my phone. She'd send me pictures of particularly ridiculous editing projects or updates from her pottery class, where she was apparently creating what she called aggressively lopsided bowls. I'd share photos from job sites or updates on the motorcycle restoration it started. Our second date was the promised pizza place, a hole-in-the-wall joint called Tony's that served slices the size of dinner plates and didn't pretend to be anything more than it was. Jenny showed up in jeans and a vintage band t-shirt, her hair in a messy bun, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. "This is more like it," she said, surveying the red vinyl booths and the ancient jukebox in the corner. "I feel like I can actually breathe in here." We shared a large pepperoni pizza and talked for 3 hours, covering everything from childhood pets to political opinions to embarrassing stories from our respective divorces. Jenny told me about the time she'd tried to surprise her ex-husband with a romantic dinner and accidentally gave him food poisoning with undercooked chicken. "He spent our anniversary night in the emergency room," she said, laughing at the memory. "I kept apologizing, and he kept insisting it was romantic that I'd tried to cook for him. That should have been a red flag right there. Who finds food poisoning romantic?" "Someone who is probably already planning his exit strategy," I said, which made her laugh even harder. "You're probably right. I think Robert was looking for reasons to prove we were incompatible. Though to be fair, my cooking really was terrible back then. Now I make a mean turkey sandwich, and I've mastered the art of not burning toast. It's taken me 3 years, but I've finally achieved basic kitchen competence." These conversations revealed layers to Jenny that made me more intrigued with each discovery. She was funny in an understated way, self-deprecating without being insecure. She asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding how I saw the world, not just waiting for her turn to talk. Our third date happened by accident. I'd been working on a commercial unit at an office building near her neighborhood when my truck wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead, and my jumper cables were apparently at the shop. I called Jenny without really thinking about it. Just needing someone to help? She showed up 20 minutes later with jumper cables and a thermos of coffee, wearing paint-splattered jeans, and looking like she'd dropped everything to come help me. "My hero," I said as she pulled her car nose tunes. "With my truck." "Don't get too excited," she replied. "I had to call my neighbor to remind me which cables go where. Apparently I'm not as mechanically inclined as I pretend to be." We got my truck running, but instead of going our separate ways, we ended up at a coffee shop down the street, talking until the barista started pointedly stacking chairs around us. It was the most natural thing in the world, this easy slide from practical help into hours of conversation. "I like this," Jenny said as we walked back to our cars. "Coffee? No, this?" She gestured between us. "How easy this feels." I spent 22 years in a marriage where everything required negotiation, where we had to plan spontaneity. This is the first time in my adult life that something has just ... flowed. I knew exactly what she meant. With my ex-wife Lisa, every interaction had felt like a performance. I was constantly monitoring my words, my tone, my reactions, trying to avoid the landmines that seemed to shift location daily. I could just be myself, the version of myself I actually liked. That weekend, she invited me to a pottery demonstration at the community center where she was taking classes. I had expected to feel out of place among what I assumed would be a group of artistic retirees. But Jenny's instructor, Amara, turned out to be a woman about our age who treated pottery like a contact sport. "The clay doesn't care about your feelings," Amara announced to the small group gathered around her wheel. "It only responds to confidence and commitment. If you're wishy-washy, it'll sense your weakness and collapse on you." Jenny leaned over and whispered, "She talks about clay the way some people talk about dating." I watched Jenny work with the clay, her face completely focused, strands of hair escaping from her ponytail. Her hands were covered in slip, and she had a smudge of clay on her cheek that she didn't seem to notice. She was concentrating so hard on centering the clay that she'd forgotten to be self-conscious, and seeing her like that, completely absorbed in the moment, was more attractive than any dress or makeup could have made her. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her wheel. "You're beautiful when you're focused," I said, which made her hands slip and her bowl collapse into a lopsided mess. "Now look what you've done," she said, but she was smiling. After the class, We walked through the small downtown area near the community center, poking into shops and talking about nothing important. Jenny bought a small succulent plant from a garden center, claiming she needed something impossible to kill for her office windowsill. I have a theory, she said as we browsed through a used bookstore, that you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat plants and how they behave in bookstores. What's your bookstore personality tell you about me? I asked, watching her flip through a cookbook with titles like Meals Even Divorced Men Can't Ruin. Systematic, she said, noting how I'd started at one end of a section and was working my way methodically through the shelves. But you're also curious about things outside your expertise. You picked up that book about architecture, and you were actually reading it, not just looking at pictures. She was right, though I hadn't realized I was being observed so carefully. You're considerate, she continued. You put every book back exactly where you found it, spine lined up properly. You respect other people's spaces. What does that mean for my plant care abilities? I'm reserving judgment until I see your apartment, she said with a grin that suggested she was already planning that visit. The day felt like a preview of something. I hadn't known I wanted lazy weekends with someone whose company I genuinely enjoyed, doing ordinary things that felt special simply because we were doing them together. As we headed back to our cars, Jenny slipped her hand into mine, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Thank you for coming today, she said. I wasn't sure if pottery demonstrations were your thing. Watching you discover things you're passionate about is definitely my thing, I replied, squeezing her hand gently. She stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression suddenly serious. Adam, I need you to know something. This isn't casual for me anymore. I know we've only been doing this for a few weeks, but I'm already in deeper than I expected to be. I felt my heart rate pick up, but not from nervousness, from relief. Good, I said, because I was starting to worry I was the only one falling here. Her smile was radiant, not even close. The shift from dating to something deeper happened gradually, then all at once. It started with small things, Jenny keeping an extra coffee cup at her house for my morning visits, me giving her a spare key to my shop so she could wait there if I was running late. These weren't grand romantic gestures. They were the quiet accommodations people make when they start weaving their lives together. One evening in early August, I was at Jenny's house helping her install a ceiling fan in her bedroom. The old unit had been wobbling dangerously, and she'd mentioned it was keeping her awake at night. What should have been a simple 30-minute job turned into a 3-hour project. When we discovered the electrical box wasn't properly secured to the ceiling joists, I'm starting to think this house is actively trying to kill me, Jenny said, holding the flashlight while I worked in the cramped attic space above her bedroom. First the AC, now this. What's next? The water heater? Don't jinx it, I called. Down through the access panel. Though I have to say, your house has character. My place is newer, but it's got all the personality of a cardboard box. That's because you haven't made it yours yet, she said. A house becomes a home when you fill it with things that matter to you. Art, books, music, memories. The good stuff that makes a space feel alive. When I finally got the ceiling fan properly installed and we tested it, Jenny sat on her bed watching the blades turn smoothly overhead. She looked content in a way that made me want to memorize the moment. Thank you, she said simply. It's nice having someone who actually knows how to fix things. It's nice having someone who appreciates the work that goes into it, I replied, settling beside her on the bed. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the gentle whoosh of the fan the only sound. Then Jenny turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? She asked. Of course. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts. When Robert left, I was devastated. Not just because my marriage was over, but because I realized I didn't know who I was without being someone's wife. I'd spent so many years defining myself through his needs, his career, his preferences that I'd completely lost track of my own. I waited, sensing there was more. The first year after the divorce was the loneliest time of my life, she continued. But somewhere in that second year, I started to discover things about myself that I'd forgotten, that I actually liked living Alone, that I could make decisions without consulting anyone else, that I was braver than I'd given myself credit for. She looked at me then, her eyes serious but warm. What scares me about this, about us, isn't that you might leave, that I might lose myself again, that I might go back to being the woman who disappears into someone else's life. I felt the weight of what she was telling me, the trust it represented. Jenny, that's not what I want. I fell for the woman who gives pottery demonstrations to her neighbors and makes inappropriate jokes at fancy restaurants. I fell for someone who knows exactly who she is and isn't afraid to take up space in the world. But what if I forget again? What if I slip back into old patterns? I reached over and took her hand. Then I'll remind you. But honestly, I don't think that's going to happen. The woman I met that first day, the one who told me she was falling for her handyman, she was completely herself, confident, direct, unafraid to say what she was thinking. That's not someone who disappears easily. Jenny smiled, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes. You say that now, but you've never lived with someone like me. I'm set in my ways. I like my morning routine. I need my quiet time to work, and I have very strong opinions about how the dishwasher should be loaded. Noted, I said with a grin. Though I should warn you that I leave tools everywhere. I talk to motorcycles like they're people, and I make terrible coffee but refuse to admit it. Your coffee isn't that bad, she lied, which made us both laugh. The conversation continued as we moved to her kitchen, where Jenny started making tea, and I found myself automatically tidying up the tools I'd scattered around during the fan installation. It struck me how natural this felt. Not the cleaning, but the easy way we moved around each other, the comfortable rhythm we'd developed. Adam, Jenny said as she filled the kettle, what do you want from this? Long term, I mean? Because I need to know if we're building toward something, or if this is just ... nice for now. It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding asking myself. Honestly, I don't know exactly what the future looks like, but I know I want you in it. I know that the days when I don't see you feel incomplete, and the days when I do see you feel like everything makes sense. She turned to face me, leaning against the counter. It's either very romantic or very codependent. Hopefully romantic, I said, though I reserve the right to occasionally be codependent about your cooking. My cooking is improving, she protested. It is that pasta salad you made last weekend was actually edible. She threw a dish towel at me, but she was smiling. These moments of playful banter had become one of my favorite things about us. The way we could shift from serious conversations about the future to teasing each other about pasta salad without missing a beat. Later that evening, as we sat on her couch with our tea, Jenny curled up against my side in a way that felt both new and familiar. She was reading while I watched a baseball game with the sound off. I found myself thinking about how this kind of ordinary domestic contentment was something I'd never experienced before. With my ex-wife, our time together had always felt like it required entertainment or agenda. We went to movies, out to dinner, to social events. We rarely just existed in the same space without purpose. But with Jenny, simply being together was enough. I have a confession, she said during the 7th-inning stretch, not looking up from her book. Another one? This is getting to be a habit. I've been thinking about asking you to stay over, she said, and I felt my heart rate spike. Not for ... well, not just for obvious reasons, but because I like the idea of waking up next to you. Making you breakfast and arguing about whether the newspapers should be read in order or randomly. I set down my beer and turned to look at her properly. What's stopping you from asking? Fear, mostly. Fear that once we cross that line, everything changes. That the mystery and excitement of this gets replaced by mundane reality. What if you hate how I look in the morning? What if I snore? What if you're one of those people who wants to talk before coffee? First of all, I've seen you covered in clay dust and paint splatter, and you looked beautiful. Second, I don't care if you snore. Third, I absolutely do not want to talk before coffee, so we're compatible there. She laughed, but I could see she was still nervous. Jenny, I can't promise that everything will stay exactly the same if we take that step. But I can promise that whatever changes won't be because I suddenly see you differently. It'll be because we'll know each other better. Trust each other more. She was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much. Pushed too hard. Finally, she looked up at me with that direct gaze that had been undoing me since the day we met. "Okay," she said simply. "Okay, stay tonight. Let's see what breakfast and newspaper arguments look like." I kissed her then, properly, for the first time since this all began, and it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, but had been searching for my entire life. The complications started 3 weeks later with a phone call that came at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I was in Jenny's kitchen, attempting to make coffee that wouldn't offend her taste buds, when her phone rang with the aggressive urgency that only comes from family members in crisis mode. "Michael," Jenny answered. "First of all, I've seen you covered in clay dust and paint splatter, and you looked beautiful. Second, I don't care if you snore. Third, I absolutely do not want to talk before coffee, so we're compatible there." She laughed, but I could see she was still nervous. "Jenny, I can't promise that everything will stay exactly the same if we take that step. But I can promise that whatever changes won't be because I suddenly see you differently. It'll be because we'll know each other better. Trust each other more." She was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much. Pushed too hard. Finally, she looked up at me with that direct gaze that had been undoing me since the day we met. "Okay," she said simply. "Okay, stay tonight. Let's see what breakfast and newspaper arguments look like." I kissed her then, properly, for the first time since this all began, and it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, but had been searching for my entire life. The complications started 3 weeks later with a phone call that came at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning. I was in Jenny's kitchen, attempting to make coffee that wouldn't offend her taste buds, when her phone rang with the aggressive urgency that only comes from family members in crisis mode. "Michael," Jenny answered, immediately alert despite having been half asleep moments before. "What's wrong?" I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Jenny's face cycle through confusion, surprise, and what looked like a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. "Slow down," she said, moving to the living room and lowering her voice. "What do you mean you're at the airport? Which airport?" I tried to give her privacy, but her kitchen was small, and even with my back turned, I could hear the tension in her voice escalating. "Now, Michael, you can't just show up unannounced. ... I don't care what your father told you. I know it's been a while since we've talked properly, but..." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the carefully controlled tone I recognized from her most difficult editing clients. "Fine. Yes, of course you can stay here. But we need to talk about this properly when you get here, okay? And Michael, next time maybe call before you get on a plane." She hung up and stood in the living room for a moment, staring at her phone like it had personally betrayed her. "Everything okay?" I asked, though it clearly WASN. "Single quotes, too?" Jenny ran her hands through her hair, a gesture I'd learned meant she was trying to reorganize her thoughts. "My son is apparently at Sky Harbor Airport. He had some kind of fight with his girlfriend, decided to fly home to figure things out, thought it would be appropriate to surprise me. That's ... spontaneous of him. That's Robert's influence," she said, settling heavily onto her couch. "Michael learned from his father that grand gestures can substitute for actual communication. Show up unexpectedly, make dramatic declarations, expect everyone else to adjust their lives accordingly. I could see this was about more than just an unexpected visit. How long has it been since you've seen him, Christmas?" 6 months ago. He was supposed to visit for spring break, but he canceled last minute for some study abroad program. Before that, maybe Thanksgiving the year before? She paused, looking out the window. I know that makes me sound like a terrible mother, but after the divorce, Michael made it pretty clear that he blamed me for breaking up the family, staying close to his father was easier than dealing with me. I sat down beside her, not sure what to say. Jenny stood up, smoothing her hair and trying to look like a woman whose Saturday morning hadn't just been completely appended. "I just need to talk to him first. Explain the situation. Can you give me maybe an hour?" Felt the distance opening up between us, The way she was already shifting back into mother mode, putting Michael's comfort ahead of our relationship. But I also understood that this was complicated territory for her. "Of course," I said, though I didn't feel good about it. "I'll head home, give you some space to figure this out." She kissed me quickly, a distracted peck that felt nothing like the way she'd kissed me the night before. "I'll call you later, okay? Once I know what's going on with him." I gathered my things while she went to answer the door, and I heard a young man's voice, confident, entitled, with just enough of Jenny's warmth to remind me that this was her son, regardless of how I was feeling about him at the moment. "Mom, God, you look good. Different, but good. Is that a new haircut? Michael, honey, what's really going on? You can't just show up like this without warning." I slipped out the back door while they were still in their initial reunion, feeling like an intruder in a space where I'd begun to feel at home. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to think. I didn't like the direction my thoughts were taking. This was exactly the kind of complication Noah had warned me about. Jenny had a whole life, a whole family dynamic that existed long before I came into the picture. Clearly, there were parts of that life where I didn't fit Isley. My phone rang as I was unlocking my apartment door. Jenny's name appeared on the screen and I answered, hoping for reassurance. "Hey," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I'm sorry about this morning. This isn't how I wanted you to meet Michael. How's he doing?" Complicated. The fight with his girlfriend was apparently pretty serious. Something about her wanting to move in together and him not being ready for that level of commitment. So he decided to run home to mommy to think about it. How old is he again? 26? Old enough to know better? Young enough to still make spectacularly poor decisions? I waited for her to bring up the obvious issue, the fact that I'd been essentially hidden from her son. She'd asked me to leave rather than deal with explaining our relationship. "Adam, about this morning, ... Yeah, I handled that badly. I should have introduced you, should have been upfront about us from the beginning. I was just caught off guard, and I defaulted to avoiding conflict instead of standing up for what we have. So what happens now?" There was a pause, and I could hear voices in the background. Michael talking to someone, maybe on his phone. "I don't know," she said honestly. "He's planning to stay for at least a week, maybe longer. And I think I need to have some difficult conversations with him about a lot of things. About the divorce, about his relationship with me, about the fact that I'm allowed to have a life that doesn't revolve around being his mother. And about me, and about you," she confirmed. "But I need to figure out how to do that without it turning into World War III. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling unsettled in a way I hadn't experienced since the early days of our relationship. For the first time, I was confronting the reality that loving Jenny meant potentially dealing with a grown man who thought his mother's happiness was less important than his comfort with the status quo. I spent the rest of the day working on my motorcycle, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of mechanical problems that had clear solutions. But even with my hands busy and music playing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Missing you. This is harder than I thought it would be." I typed back, "Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." But as I sent the message, I wondered if that was entirely true. Because for the first time since this all started, I was questioning whether what we had was strong enough to weather the complications that came with it. The next few days would test that in ways I wasn't prepared for. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on Thursday evening. I hadn't seen Jenny in 4 days, the longest we'd gone without contact since we'd started dating. Our text exchanges had become increasingly strained, filled with a kind of polite distance that usually signaled the beginning of the end. I was closing up the shop when my phone rang. Jenny's name on the screen made my heart rate spike with a mixture of hope and dread. "Can you come over?" she asked without preamble. Her voice sounded exhausted, defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "Of course. Is everything okay?" "No," she said simply. "Nothing is okay. But I think we need to talk." The drive to her house felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I found myself rehearsing conversations, trying to prepare for whatever version of this isn't working she was planning to deliver. When I pulled into her driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar rental car parked on the street, Michael's. Presumably, Jenny opened the door before I could knock, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her usual composed confidence had been replaced by something raw and fragile. "He's not here," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "He went to dinner with his father. They're apparently discussing my situation." The way she said situation, with air quotes and barely contained fury, told me everything I needed to know about how the week had gone. "Jenny, what happened?" She led me to her kitchen, where I could see evidence of the stress she'd been under. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, takeout containers on the counter, her normally pristine space looking like someone had given up on maintaining. Appearances. "I told him about you on Tuesday," she said, leaning against the counter like she needed the support. I thought I was being honest, mature. I explained that I was seeing someone, that it was serious, that I was happy. How did he take it? Jenny laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He asked how old you were. When I told him, he said, and I quote, 'Mom, you're embarrassing yourself. This is exactly the kind of thing Dad said you'd do.' I felt anger rise in my chest, but I tried to keep my voice level. What else did Robert say, apparently? That I'd go through some kind of midlife crisis after the divorce. That I'd make poor decisions trying to prove I was still attractive. That I'd eventually come to my senses and realize that dignity was more important than whatever I was trying to prove. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Michael believes that. Michael thinks his father is a saint who was driven away by my unreasonable expectations and emotional instability." She ran her hands through her hair, that gesture I'd come to recognize as her trying to hold herself together. "He spent 3 days lecturing me about appropriate behavior for women my age, about how dating someone 12 years younger makes me look desperate and pathetic. What did you tell him?" "I told him that my relationship with you was none of his business. That I was 50 years old and capable of making my own decisions about my personal life. That his father's opinion about what I should or shouldn't do stopped mattering the day he left me for someone young enough to be his daughter." She paused, looking out the window at the gathering dusk. "He said I was proving his point, that I was being defensive because I knew he was right." I wanted to say something, to offer comfort or reassurance, but I could see she wasn't finished. "The worst part is that he made me doubt myself," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the first time since we started this, I found myself wondering if he was right, if I was making a fool of myself. If this thing between us was just some kind of delayed rebellion against my marriage ending." My heart sank. "And what did you decide?" Jenny turned to face me then, and I could see tears she was trying not to shed. "I decided that I'm tired of letting other people's opinions dictate my choices. I'm tired of trying to be the woman Michael thinks I should be, or the woman Robert expected me to be. I'm tired of apologizing for wanting things that make me happy." The relief I felt was so intense, it was almost physical. "So where does that leave us?" "It leaves us with a choice," she said. "I told Michael that you're important to me, that this relationship isn't going anywhere, and if he can't accept that, then we have a bigger problem than my dating life." How did he respond? He said he needed time to think about it, that he was disappointed in me but hoped I'd come to my senses before I did any more damage to the family's reputation. Her voice hardened. Then he called his father to discuss my erratic behavior. I felt a surge of protective anger. Bye, Jenny. You don't have to choose between your son and your happiness. But you also don't have to let him hold your emotional well-being hostage. Don't I?" she asked, and for the first time, I heard real uncertainty in her voice. "Adam, he's my son. It's the only family I have left. If I lose him over this—" "You won't lose him," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "He might need time to adjust, but if he loves you, he'll want you to be happy. But what if he doesn't? What if this is the thing that permanently damages our relationship?" I realized this was the moment I'd been dreading since Noah first warned me about the complications of dating someone with a different life situation. Jenny was being forced to choose between her past and her future, between family loyalty and personal happiness. "I can't make that choice for you," I said quietly. "If you decide that maintaining your relationship with Michael is more important than what we have, I'll understand. I won't like it, but I'll understand." She looked at me with something that might have been surprise. "You'd really walk away if I asked you to." I'd hate every second of it, but yes, because I love you too much to be the thing that destroys your relationship with your son. It was the first time either of us had used the word love out loud, and it hung in the air between us like something fragile and precious. "Say that again," she whispered. "I love you, Jenny. I love your strength, your independence, your terrible cooking, and your inappropriate jokes. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me see myself. I love you enough to let you go if that's what you need." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed me with an intensity that felt like a decision being made. We broke apart. She rested her forehead against mine. "I love you too," she said, "and I'm done letting fear make my choices for me." What does that mean? It means Michael is going to have to accept that his mother is a whole person with her own life, or he's going to have to learn to live with disappointment. I spent 22 years putting other people's comfort ahead of my own happiness. Not doing it anymore? For the first time in days, I felt like we might actually survive this. The real test came 2 days later when Michael returned to Jenny's house to find me there. I'd come over Saturday morning to help Jenny install new shelving. In her home office, a project we'd planned weeks earlier but had postponed because of the family drama. When Michael walked through the front door using his key, I was on a ladder with a power drill, and Jenny was holding the level. The silence that followed was deafening. Jenny said, her voice steady, despite the tension, "I'd like you to meet Adam. Adam, this is my son, Michael." I climbed down from the ladder and extended my hand. Michael looked at it for a long moment before shaking it with obvious reluctance. "So you're the midlife crisis," he said, and I felt Jenny stiffen. Beside me, "I'm the guy who's in love with your mother," I replied calmly, "and she's in love with me." Michael's jaw tightened. "Mom, can we talk privately?" "No," Jenny said, surprising both of us. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Adam. He's part of my life now, which means this concerns him too." For the next hour, we had what was probably the most uncomfortable conversation of my life. Michael laid out every objection he'd been harboring: the age difference, the optics of his mother dating someone younger, his concerns about my motivations, his belief that Jenny was making decisions based on loneliness rather than genuine feelings. But something remarkable happened as the conversation progressed. Instead of backing down or trying to placate him, Jenny stood her ground. She defended our relationship with a clarity and conviction that reminded me why I'd fallen for her in the first place. "Michael, I understand this is difficult for you," she said after he'd finished his litany of concerns, "but I need you to understand something. I spent 22 years of my marriage putting other people's comfort ahead of my own needs. I made myself smaller so your father could feel bigger. I apologize for having opinions that differed from his. I learned to disappear into the background of my own life." She looked at me, then back at her son. "I'm not doing that anymore. Not for you, not for your father, not for anyone. Adam sees me as I am and loves me for it. He encourages me to take up space, to have opinions, to pursue things that make me happy. He's not threatened by my independence. He celebrates it." "Mom, what about the future? What about when you want to travel, or when you need someone to take care of you when you're older?" "He's going to want different things." "Different from what?" Jenny interrupted. "Different from the plans your father and I never made because we couldn't even have a conversation about the future without fighting. Different from the retirement we never discussed because he was too busy planning his exit strategy." She softened slightly. "Honey, I know you want me to be safe. But safe isn't the same as happy. I'd rather have 5 years of genuine happiness with someone who sees me as an equal partner than 20 years of security with someone who sees me as a burden to be managed." Michael was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked at me. "You really love her?" "More than I knew was possible," I said. "And you're not going to hurt her?" "I'm going to do everything in my power not to. More than that, I'm going to support her in being exactly who she is, without trying to change her or control her." Michael nodded slowly, I guess I thought all men were like Dad, that eventually you'd want her to be someone she's not." "Your father's loss is my gain," I said. "I get to love the woman he was too insecure to appreciate." Something shifted in Michael's expression. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked like he might actually be seeing me as a person rather than a threat. "I'm sorry," he said to Jenny. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just trying to control you, just like Dad used to." Jenny's eyes filled with tears as she hugged her son. "Thank you for saying that. That's all I needed, for you to trust that I know what's best for my own life." "Can we start over?" Michael asked, looking at both of us. "I'd like that," Jenny said, squeezing my hand. 6 months later, I was back under the hood of a car in Jenny's driveway, but this time it was my choice. The 1978 Honda CB750 I'd been restoring was finally ready for its first real test ride. Jenny had insisted on documenting the moment with enough photos to fill a scrapbook. "Are you sure it's not going to explode?" she asked, circling the motorcycle with her camera like she was conducting a mechanical inspection. "Pretty sure," I said, tightening the last bolt on the engine cover. "Though if it does, at least you'll have photographic evidence for the insurance." "Claim very reassuring," she said, but she was smiling. "Seriously though, Adam, this is incredible. Can't believe you built this from scratch." I stood back and looked at the bike, trying to see it through her eyes. The deep blue paint job had taken me weeks to perfect, and every chrome piece had been carefully restored to mirror brightness. It wasn't just a motorcycle anymore. It was proof that broken things could be made beautiful again. "We built this," I corrected her. "You spent half your weekends in my garage, handing me tools and listening to me curse at stubborn bolts. I mostly just provided moral support and terrible coffee." "Your coffee has improved significantly," I said, which earned me a playful shove. The truth was, the motorcycle had become something of a metaphor for us. What had started as a pile of rusted parts had slowly been transformed into something that worked not just functionally, but beautifully. It had taken patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to start over when something didn't fit quite right. Jenny's front door opened. Michael emerged, carrying 2 cups of what I hoped was the good coffee his mother had finally learned to make. Over the past 6 months, he'd become something I'd never expected, a friend. It had taken time, and more than a few awkward conversations. But eventually we'd found common ground in our shared love for Jenny and our mutual appreciation for things that required careful maintenance. "Mom, your neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if Adam can look at her garbage disposal," he said, handing us the coffee. "Apparently word's gotten out that you have a live-in handyman." "I'm not live-in," I protested, though it was mostly technicality at this point. I still kept my apartment, but I spent most nights at Jenny's house, and half my tools had somehow migrated to her garage. "You're here more than I was when I actually lived here," Michael pointed out, which was probably true. "Speaking of which," Jenny said, settling onto her porch steps, where this had all begun, "I have something to tell you both." Michael and I exchanged a look. Jenny's announcements had become significantly less stressful over the past few months, but she still had a tendency toward dramatic timing. "I've been thinking about selling the house," she said, which was definitely not what either of us had expected. "Mom, why?" Michael asked, sitting down beside her. "You love this place?" "I do," she said. "But it's too big for one person. And Adam's apartment is too small for 2 people who've accumulated entirely too many books and motorcycle parts." I felt my heart rate pick up. "You suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we find a place that's ours," she said, looking at me with that direct gaze that still made my chest tight after all these months. "A place where you can have a proper workshop. And I can have an office that doesn't double as a storage room for your wrenches. You want to move in together officially?" "I want to build something with you," she said simply. "Something that's not his house or her house, but our house." Michael grinned. "Does this mean I finally get to stop pretending I don't know you're sleeping over most nights?" "You were being discreet," Jenny protested. "Mom, Adam's truck has been in your driveway every morning for 3 months. The only person you were fooling was yourself." I laughed because it was true. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped talking about my visits and started talking about our plans. Jenny had started saying we instead of I when she talked about the future, and I'd begun thinking of her problems as our problems to solve together. "So what do you think?" Jenny asked, and I realized she was nervous. After everything we'd been through, she was still worried I might not be ready for the next step. I set down my coffee and took her hands in mine. I think I said that I fell in love with a woman who was brave enough to tell her handyman how she felt. Yeah. And now that same woman is brave enough to ask for what she wants.
Yes.
So yes, let's find our house. She kissed me then, right there on her front porch, where this whole crazy story had started. And I realized that sometimes the best things in life really do begin with something as simple as a broken air conditioner and the courage to speak your truth. For the record, I said, when we broke apart, you're still the first in 50 years to get my number, but you're also going to be the last. Promise? She asked. Promise. Michael made exaggerated gagging sounds from the porch steps, but he was smiling. And for the first time since this all began, I felt like we'd found our way to something that was going to last. The motorcycle could wait. We had a future to plan. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.